Thank you for joining us. I am happy to introduce the first of EPIC's career series, starting off with Gwen Gallagher, who works with the New York Sea Grant as a coastal climate specialist. Prior to joining the Sea Grant, she earned her work focuses on climate change impacts and mitigation, including working with offshore wind, carbon sequestration, and ocean acidification. And prior to her work, she earned her Ph.D. in Geophysical Sciences at the University of Chicago, where she researched different microbial lifestyles in the ocean impact, how they impact the global carbon cycle. So without further ado, go ahead and start.
Thank you. Can you see my screen properly? Okay, great. My name is Gwen, and I currently work at New York Sea Grant. I'm their coastal climate specialist. So just break down what exactly that means. So first, Sea Grant, there are 34 Sea Grant programs, and each program is a federal university partnership. NOAA is the federal agency, and then the university depends on location. I'm in New York, and our Sea Grant universities are the SUNY schools and Cornell. So technically, I am employed by Cornell, but physically, I work on Long Island at Stony Brook University, which is one of the SUNY schools. The program that covers Chicago is the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. And the purpose of Sea Grant in general is to support coastal communities through research, extension, and education. More generally, we're supposed to be objective, neutral resources for stakeholders concerning all things coastal, marine, or Great Lakes related. The key here is neutrality. So in my role, I am not supposed to have or share my opinions. I'm supposed to give stakeholders information and facts, and then they can make their own decisions. So specifically, I'm at New York Sea Grant. New York Sea Grant has about 30 employees across the state, and there are almost 20 of us that are extension staff. So each extension person has a specialty, and we create programming around that focus area. This could mean partnering up with a researcher to help them share the results of their work with the public, helping stakeholders learn about science and technology relevant to a local problem they're experiencing, showing stakeholders how to engage in federal, state, and local processes. So my coworkers' specialties include things like aquaculture, flooding, coastal processes, and seafood safety. I am the coastal climate specialist, which is a new position that was designed to fill stakeholder needs. My portfolio includes offshore wind, carbon sequestration and carbon cycling, and ocean acidification. A local act was passed in New York, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act, which, among other things, requires that the state procure 9 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2035. New York Sea Grant recognized that this rapid shift to an ocean-based renewable energy is going to impact a lot of stakeholders. There are people living and working on the waterfront. There's new port development in the state. Current ocean users like fishermen will have to navigate sharing this space with developers, and it will impact people living near power plants and substations. Some of these impacts to stakeholders are positive and some are negative. I am not the only Sea Grant employee hired to work on offshore wind. There are me equivalents hired in New Hampshire and Rhode Island. And other programs are actively working on building capacity to hire offshore wind folks as well. So that may be something to keep an eye out if you're interested. This picture is a picture of the 5 offshore wind turbines on Block Island in Rhode Island. Currently, the United States only has 7 offshore wind turbines, these 5 in Rhode Island, and then 2 off Virginia. So for the presentation, I'm going to give a little context, share some of the work I've been doing, and then finally get to how I got there, hopefully help other students that are interested in pursuing science policy or science communication after school. New York State has a lot of work to do in the upcoming years to meet their mandates through the Climate Act. Currently, the majority of New York's electricity comes from natural gas-fired power plants. Nuclear energy generation is the second largest contribution to the energy portfolio, but while carbon-free, it's not a renewable energy source. Hydropower and other renewables only make up 29% of the current energy portfolio. This picture of the state's energy portfolio becomes a bit more nuanced when comparing upstate and downstate electricity generation. Here I have a stacked bar graph detailing where and how power is being generated. Gray is downstate and green is upstate. Upstate New York is considerably cleaner. Its portfolio is 50% renewable, 44% nuclear, and only 6% fossil fuel based. In downstate New York, 89% of the electricity is generated with fossil fuels. This major difference is attributed to the abundance of resources upstate, like hydropower from Niagara Falls, more space for land-based wind. What I'm seeing is downstate New York stakeholders have no idea where their energy comes from, but there is some pride for renewables in upstate New York. So offshore wind can provide energy where it is most needed in New York. On the left here, I have a graphic from the US Census Bureau showing where the population is distributed from the 2010 census. As you can see in bright white, most of the population is by the coasts, and especially that's the case for New York, where Long Island is all white and New York City is all white as well. It's a very densely populated area. Offshore wind may be a good resource for New York because it generates power where it is needed or where the population is dense. So a quick overview of how it works. Offshore wind turbines are installed and they are connected with cables underground. The cables connect to an offshore substation, and then another cable is brought to land to an onshore substation. The norm is to horizontally directional drill onto land, so beaches are not disturbed. Then once electricity is at the onshore substation, it can then be injected into the grid. So how much energy are we talking? I put together this chart to show the scale of offshore wind. All of the units are in megawatts. So a residential solar panel is between 100 and 500 watts, so 0.001 megawatt. A solar field like the one pictured on the bottom left, which is in New York, has on average 5 megawatts of power. And you can see that the amount of land it takes up is quite a bit. So onshore wind, we're getting about 1 to 3 megawatts per turbine, and then offshore is 15 megawatts per turbine. So you can see this picture on the bottom right to show this scale. The turbines on the left are onshore, and then you can see they are much larger offshore. Basically, the size is proportional to how much energy you have, and you can have much larger turbines offshore. And the amount of energy generated from an offshore wind array is comparable to something like a nuclear power plant. In New York, nuclear power plants generate between 580 and 2,000 megawatts. So quickly, I'll give a landscape of the offshore wind areas in New York. The term you need to know is BOEM, or the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They have the authority to lease areas on the outer continental shelf. So that's what these little colored blocks are. They're different leases. Developers bid on lease blocks to explore offshore wind development. Permits and state offtake agreements are not a guarantee. So once they procure the lease, then they can explore getting the proper permits to develop. So again, one of the reasons why offshore wind is so appealing to the state is because it generates electricity close to where it's needed, which is downstate, where there's still a huge reliance on burning fossil fuels. Over the next few slides, I'm going to familiarize everyone with activities in the New York Bight region. Here's a map of the active leases and wind energy areas in the region. Shaded in gray are active BOEM leases that either have power purchase agreements with states other than New York or do not have power purchase agreements yet. In green, we have the new areas that were leased in 2022 earlier this year. It was the New York Bight auction. This auction resulted in record-breaking prices for federal offshore leases. They surpassed both prior offshore wind and offshore oil and gas prices. The leases went for between $250 million and $1.1 billion. The total amount secured for these 6 leases was $4.37 billion. These areas outlined in a teal color were removed from consideration in that auction, but BOEM may reconsider them down the road. I kept them on here to highlight how complicated this co-location and multi-use in the ocean is. So they were excluded because there's heavy maritime traffic here. The US Coast Guard is proposing a tug and tow lane. There were concerns about visual impacts to Long Islanders. There are concerns about impacts to the fishing industry. So the oceans are very active with human uses. It's a very busy place. Finally, the leases that are shaded in blue represent where New York State has procured offshore wind energy. The first procurement was in 2017 and is circled in yellow. It's on the top right-hand side of the map. This is South Fork Wind Farm, and it was procured privately by the Long Island Power Authority, or LIPA. This private procurement was the result of a competitive solicitation to meet the energy needs of South Fork on Long Island. So I hope you can see my mouse, but I'm highlighting where South Fork is. This area suffers from brownouts and uses temporary generators to meet the local electricity needs. The competitive solicitation did not specify offshore wind as the energy source, but that is what ended up winning the proposal. I want to highlight again that this area has an energy shortage problem. This is a good case study for the differences between upstate New York and downstate. South Fork is an area that needs more electricity, but is culturally not used to having energy generation facilities nearby. So as I go through the next couple of procurements, I'm going to keep a tally on the table of megawatts procured. In 2018, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, launched their first solicitation for offshore wind on behalf of New York State. The winning procurements are circled in yellow. Equinor's Empire Wind 1 will generate 816 megawatts, and Ørsted's Sunrise Wind will generate 924. NYSERDA's second solicitation for offshore wind energy was in 2020. Equinor's Empire Wind 2 will generate 1,260 megawatts for the state, and Equinor's Beacon Wind will generate 1,230 megawatts. Finally, NYSERDA recently launched their third solicitation this July. All of the leases highlighted in white are eligible to apply for the solicitation because they do not have power offtake agreements yet. NYSERDA is seeking at least 2,000 megawatts, which brings New York State's offshore wind energy procurement to 6,300 megawatts. The state's mandated goal is 9,000 megawatts by 2035. So in addition to its footprint offshore, it also has a large on-land footprint. There are onshore transmission cables and substations needed to inject energy in the grid. This map highlights the result of the 2017 NYSERDA port analysis that investigated potential port options for offshore wind. The 5 purple stars are 5 port locations so far where financial commitments have been made or they are actively seeking grants. The 2 ports near Albany up north on the Hudson River will be manufacturing ports. So one will be a tower factory and one will be a foundation manufacturing plant. The ports in Brooklyn and on Long Island will be operations and maintenance hubs, and the ports on Staten Island and Brooklyn will be staging facilities. I want to highlight that much of the planned onshore infrastructure falls in environmental justice communities, And this highlights the need for community engagement and outreach. New York State also has coasts on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. NYSERDA has been conducting a Great Lakes offshore wind feasibility study that is expected to come out any day now. There's a lot of developer interest in offshore wind in the Great Lakes, especially in Lake Erie, which is relatively shallow. A 6-turbine pilot project is underway in Cleveland called the Icebreaker Project. As you may recall, upstate New York already has strong clean energy portfolio. There has been local opposition already. Upstate New Yorkers are not thrilled about the idea of offshore wind in the Great Lakes for the benefit of downstate New York. The border with Canada would also first force turbines to be much closer to shore in Lake Erie off New York. For example, the distance between Buffalo and the Canadian border is only about a mile. So my job is to keep track of all this information and figure out what stakeholders' needs are and help out stakeholders. So through informal stakeholder needs identification, a few topics have come to our attention. One is awareness of where electricity comes from in New York. While many upstate New Yorkers are aware, downstate New York is largely not aware of its dependence on fossil fuels. The second is familiarity with offshore wind in general, especially among stakeholders not associated with NGOs or nonprofits. There are a lot of organizations working on offshore wind in New York, but folks not associated with organizations are not getting information. The third is understanding how and when people can participate in offshore wind development at the federal, state, and local level. And finally, there is a potential need to prepare upstate New York for offshore wind in the Great Lakes, depending on the results of the feasibility study. So what have I been doing? I've been in my position.
Hold on. We have a quick question. So someone asked, what is the typical lifespan for one of the wind farms?
That's a great question. So the first ones in Europe are being decommissioned now, so over 20 years. The leases are active for 20, 25 years, I don't remember, but they can be renewed depending on the life cycle of the turbine. So a long time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I've been in my position for almost a year. It'll be a year next month. And I have been putting together some resources for stakeholders to try to fill these gaps. They're in the final stages of development and are under review. So they're not published yet, but they're almost. Our New York Energy Guide explains where electricity comes from and what changes New Yorkers can expect as the Climate Act is enacted. It also covers other energy sources relevant to Sea Grant, like hydropower and the new transmission cable coming from Canada to Queens, which is from hydropower in Canada. I'm also working on public participation guides. So the first is a federal guide explaining BOEM's process, defining jargon, and highlighting opportunities for engagement. I'm working on a guide for onshore transmission permitting in New York and potentially a Great Lakes guide where states have jurisdiction and not BOEM. The purpose of these guides is to reduce barriers to participation by making sure stakeholders are on the same page and understand the process fully. This graphic on the bottom is not ours. It's copied in every offshore wind permitting process presentation and guide. The problem is it highlights the linear timeline, but it is very confusing to stakeholders. The jargon's not defined, the process isn't explained, and it leaves a lot of people feeling overwhelmed. There is a barrier to entry in the process because people throw out abbreviations like COP or SAP, and they're just not terms that stakeholders are familiar with. So the guide I'm putting together will serve as a resource to demystify the process and help stakeholders learn the language, learn how to talk about this, provide past examples, and reduce barriers to commenting in the Federal Register. I had a law student working with me this summer who worked on explainers for laws that frequently come up with stakeholders, such as the Jones Act and NEPA. And talking a bit about grad school, this was very similar to working with lab mates or being a TA and working with undergrads. It's the same skills. I'm also doing extension for an offshore renewable energy project that was funded by the Northeast Sea Grant Consortium. So that project is being led by a Cornell PI who is creating a multi-use tool for offshore wind and aquaculture. And finally, I am hopefully working on a collaboration with Stony Brook to provide lessons for a K-12 offshore wind STEM curriculum. So these projects have started up within a year of me being hired, but there's a lot of work to be done regarding offshore wind in New York. There are almost endless opportunities for New York Sea Grant to engage in the future. So that's what I've been up to, but take a step back and see how I got here. So my personal career journey, these are my official work experiences. So I got my undergraduate degree from Barnard College in 2015. It was a BA in biochemistry. And I had 3 work experiences through that. I spent a summer in a biomedical lab studying bone fracture healing. I spent 1.5 years in an environmental bioinorganic chemistry lab studying protein thermodynamics. The big picture of that work was understanding how proteins function in microbes that live in different temperatures that are also important in bioremediation after oil spills. And then I spent 4 years as a lab assistant for my work study financial aid. And then my official experience from graduate school, I got my Ph.D. from Geophysical Sciences last August. So through that, I had 6 years of experience in a biogeochemistry lab studying how a specific protein impacts microbial metabolism and survival. I spent 12 years TAing. This was really good experience and helped me with my job now, especially curriculum development for an environmental chemistry lab. And then I spent 3 months in a My Choice internship at the Morton Arboretum. I think a big thing that should stand out is that none of this has anything to do with offshore wind. And that's because you gain a lot of transferable skills in graduate school. So even if the topic isn't exactly what you end up doing, you have a lot of skills. The biggest 3 I think I use in my job now are science communication, research skills, and self-management. So science communication is distilling and translating complex information for stakeholders, putting together and giving presentations. And the biggest is knowing your audience, being able to tailor presentations to different stakeholder groups. For research skills, a lot of primary literature research, like critical thinking to identify reputable sources, especially because I'm not as familiar with this field. Data organization, attention to detail, project management. And then the last is self-management. So I'm the first person in my position. I didn't inherit a program or a network. And so building that up is very similar to managing yourself in lab and developing your own methods. And then finally, how I actually got my job was through extracurriculars. So I think it's really important to explore your passions. If you find something that you are energized by and curious about, keep exploring it, even if it's not 100% related to your current work. It's how you will be able to transition to things that you are passionate about, and it makes that transition a lot more natural. So I was very involved in the science policy group, which I think did not survive virtual pandemic life, but it was great for developing leadership, programming, event planning experience. There are so many opportunities at U Chicago for this, like EPIC, ways to get involved. With some friends in the science policy group, I published a policy memo called Establishing Climate Change Resilience in the Great Lakes in Response to Flooding. This was mentioned a lot when I was interviewing. They were excited to see someone that had interests in both the Great Lakes and the oceans. My position is statewide, and so they wanted to make sure that they had someone that understood what was going on in both regions. I was involved with the National Science Policy Network. It's a network for scientists interested in science policy. It's mostly grad students, grad student run, and it was really good for networking and career exploration. So I didn't get my position from networking, but becoming friends with people that have the same interests with you helps. And my friends now are all in science policy positions. So it was a more organic form of networking, which I was more comfortable doing. And then the last was a course I took through Science and Technology Policy Academy. This woman, Dr. Deborah Stein, made this academy, and she is an engineer that transitioned to policy. So her class, Public Policy Analysis for Scientists, Engineers, and Health Professionals, it was an online course that I took. And through that, I wrote a policy memo called Achieving Offshore Wind Goals in New Jersey. I submitted that as my writing sample for this position, and I think that's how I got it. If you are interested in her classes, there's a discount if you're part of the National Science Policy Network, which is a lot less expensive. I think generally transitioning from grad school to this job, it was transitioning from being an expert to a generalist. Before I was the expert on that one protein, but now I need to keep track of commercial fishing, transmission, grid infrastructure, maritime. There's just so much more. And I think that being involved in my extracurriculars helped to make that transition a little bit easier, because I was already flexing that muscle of talking about things that weren't necessarily in my field of study. But that's all I have. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a lovely talk. And so we'll now open it up for any questions that you have. Just raise your hand so that we can see and allow you to talk. But to start off, just sort of for students who may be interested in policy or working for the government, what would you say is a good transition between like grad school and government work, given that I think a lot of the perception is that it's for like research positions, you know, with the university and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think, well, the one I always heard when I was attending these talks is to do the fellowships. So like the CNAS fellowship, AAAS, there's a whole bunch of them. I did not go that route. I instead applied for jobs that I thought would be fun. And I really lucked out with this one. So this one it's a federal university partnership. So the academic culture is definitely still present. It feels like a nice transition because I'm still interacting with professors. I'm employed by Cornell, but I also have a lot of interactions with people that work at federal agencies and state agencies.
Good to know. Thank you. And then also, just for my own curiosity, I don't know that much about offshore wind, so it was very interesting hearing about it. And so the larger turbines that are offshore, are there any study, it seems kind of new, but are there any studies about how that affects wildlife, or is that under researched or sort of, yeah.
Yes, both of those things. There needs to be a lot more research. A lot of the focus is on like birds and bats, impacts to wildlife, impacts to species that are relevant for commercial fisheries. But a lot more work needs to be done. Developers are funding a lot of this research. Federal government is funding this research. A lot of it's basically like a very chaotic space. I think an organization that is associated with NYSERDA, who I mentioned a lot, just published a list of research needs, and it's over 800. So there's, if you're a researcher in this space, like, yeah, there are a lot of needs right now.
Okay, I don't see any hands yet, but one final question for me. Could you talk a little bit more? I know it was sort of future directions, but could you talk a little bit more about the K through 12 STEM curriculum as someone who's interested in science education? That seemed really cool.
Yeah, so that is tentative. It will hopefully happen. Basically, there was a large grant for workforce development, and there are some leftover funds that people are hoping to adapt a curriculum that was for people interested in transitioning to the offshore wind workforce for K through 12. I'm specifically interested in developing curriculum that goes over like the wildlife aspects. So impacts to wildlife, ecological impacts, that is more of my comfort zone, not like explaining the grid to K through 12 students. So yeah, hopefully that happens. We've been in talks for a while, and they're doing a needs assessment with superintendents in New York. So either way, I am also interested in curriculum development. So I'm sure I will make it happen some way.
It seems very exciting. So definitely hope it does. And then, yes, we have another question from an audience member. So
yes, Joe has raised his hand. Joe, I've allowed you to talk if you want to ask your question to Gwen.
Oh, howdy, SPG president. Long time no see.
Yeah, hi,
Sorry
Joe.
for not keeping it alive. I'm just wondering, have you been running into any of us MPP policy analyst types in your line of work ever since you graduated?
Policy analysts, not really. I am interested in that field, but I haven't come across them. So the people I interact with most are people working for NYSERDA. So at the state level, they're the ones that are writing these, it's called OREC, procuring energy for the state. There are different branches of them. So there's an environmental technical working group and a fisheries technical working group. I interact with them the most. Federal level, people from BOEM, I interact with people from DOE, but not analysts. So yeah, which is a little surprising.
No worries, thanks. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, and then we have a couple of typed questions. We have, who is doing the feasibility study for the Great Lakes offshore wind? What is their role / job title?
That's NYSERDA. So the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, they are the ones that are spearheading this. The team, the offshore wind group, I think is a team of like maybe 10. And they are putting together a lot of like preliminary environmental research as part of the feasibility study. I have not seen it. It's due any day now, though, so I'm excited to see it.
And would that research like be available publicly? Do you know?
It will be once it's published. Yeah.
Okay. And where could they? Yeah, where could we find it?
NYSERDA's website. They if you sign up for their listserv too, they are really good at providing information. If you're interested in offshore wind generally, I recommend their I think it's called Learning with the Experts series. They have like a couple dozen YouTube videos online of experts talking about different aspects of offshore wind. So yeah, it's a great resource, and it's accessible information.
Okay, thank you. Someone else asked, you mentioned that you were looking for jobs that look fun to you. So like what types of things were you looking for?
That's a great question. So I became interested in offshore wind as a topic through that policy course I took. The advice I was given during that policy course is to look at local news to see what people are interested in. And I zoned in on New Jersey environmental local news, and it was offshore wind was the stuff that was coming up a lot. So I am interested in offshore wind as a topic. I was also looking for jobs that fit my skill set, or like fit the parts of grad school that I liked the most. I liked doing outreach. I liked being a part of the science policy group. I liked learning about policy. And so, yeah, it was important to me to find something that I was like endlessly curious about. And offshore wind is so interdisciplinary. I don't think I'll ever get bored exploring different aspects. I can see the next question, is my position permanent? So New York Sea grant, it's kind of interesting. So every 3 years you do a review. It's kind of like a baby 10-year review maybe. So most of the positions after 3 years, you go through this review. My position is fully funded for 2 years, and part of my role is securing grants to continue it. So for extension specialists at New York Sea Grant, all of the applications say 2 years or 3 years with opportunity to extend based on your performance. But a lot of people stay for a long time. Someone's retiring this month who's been there for 38 years, which is much longer than 3. So yeah, kind of permanent. It's hard to answer.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. Are you sort of open to having students reach out to you if they have more questions?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Would you mind just like putting your email in the chat? That might work.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
That's fine. Awesome. Okay, then. If we don't have any more questions, I will let you go. So thank you again so much for this career panel. I think it was very valuable and very useful information, especially as we're trying to get students to get an idea of like what different career paths are out there. So this is very helpful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was nice.